Greetings, this is Mr. Nobody with the final installment of what happened with January 6th. At the beginning of this series, I started out by pointing out that I had expected in advance that something would happen to prevent America from seeing very much evidence come out on the congressional floor. It should be obvious by now the reasons why. I saw many evidences come up only to disappear. They could come up because normal news media suppressed the stories. But you could find stuff in some of the various social media. It would be uploaded by people who saw something, who reported something, who were something, who captured something. They uploaded it. I happened to come across it. And then later on, it disappeared. It would just disappear. Clearly, a very large and controlled effort was being done in order, and deliberate effort was being done to suppress this information. But one thing that became clear was that when we get to the meeting where all these electoral votes get counted, Congress can break up and have into two parties, into two groups, one for the House and one for Congress, for each state for which there is doubt. Actually, 7 states had submitted dueling electors, a second slate of electors. The parliamentarians, Pence may have lied, but more likely the parliamentarians were lying to Pence when they said, oh, there's only one. No, there were 2. The parliamentarians, if that's what they said to Pence, they were lying, pure and simple. There were 2 slates of electors for each of 7 states. However, one of the states, New Mexico, was not really close enough to be very likely to have been thrown. We don't know. At any rate, 6 states remained. And for each of those states, Congress would break up between Senate and House into separate chambers, and inside those separate chambers, the evidences of all the fraud that had been taken on would be debated, would be formally debated. And there was one could probably estimate some of the structure. Arizona would have focused primarily on the constitutional issues, since a lot of what was done there had to do with changing rules as far as when people can register to vote, who can vote, how little you're going to observe whether or not they're citizens, how little you're going to observe whether signatures match, how little you're going to observe whether ballots are mailed in by any specific deadline, or even how unregulated postal marks will be. So all these things were opened everywhere. And so the issues in Arizona were mostly constitutional, though they did manage to bring a few other things into account. And then they would move to Georgia. For Georgia, seeing is believing. And actually watching the perpetrators of this fraud getting caught in the act would be very persuasive. As I say, I think even a few Democrats would have to at least say, we want to win, but not by cheating. We should at least investigate this. It wouldn't have taken very many. So we could have had Georgia be forced to go back and do, an audit, and to do the recount based on that audit. Okay? And then it would have been the same for the other states as we go through the alphabet, because they do them all alphabetically. So that was how that was supposed to go. Now that would have been, now picture this, 6 states objected to. 6 times, House and Senate each have 2 hours to debate this thing. So 2 hours each thing, that's already 12 hours of solid debate on these things. And then when you count that, because you've got both the Senate doing its and the House doing its, that's really up to a full 24 hours of rock-solid debate and presentation of all of these evidences in a place where they cannot be deleted. You could pull stuff off of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. You could pull stuff off of all of these things, make it all disappear. But once it's on the congressional floor, in either the House or the Senate, it's there for keeps. It's there for reals. It cannot be deleted. It is there. It is on record. And it has to be faced. And then somebody would have to try, if they could, to disprove it. But in that very attempt, it's more likely to end up proving at least most of it. Probably all, or very close to all of it. Certainly the constitutional issues are one and all evidentiary because they are fairly straightforward. Changes were made, those changes were not made or authorized by the state legislatures. Those changes affected the outcome. So that's what we had. That was going to happen. It's 24 hours of this. You can cover an awful lot of material, more even than anyone would have even been aware of. And yet, they couldn't stop that. Or could they? I had the suspicion they don't want any of that out there. They want all of it to disappear. How are they going to stop it? Well, I knew what they wanted to do. Obviously, they were doing it. For 2 solid months, they were doing it. Evidence of fraud comes up, evidence of fraud vanishes. Poof. That's what I've summarized in my list of items I talked about in the earlier one, the evidence that vanished. But we will still get to when Congress meets for this big vote counting, and all these 6 states are each objected, and those objections require 2-hour debates in each of the 2 chambers of Congress. You can't make that go away. Even if they delete all the online references to it, which could still happen, I'm surprised it hasn't, it's still there printed in the Congressional record. And there it will always be. So the only thing I did not know was how would they do this? The picture I had in mind at the time was wrong. I figured probably C-SPAN will go dark and nobody will ever know what actually took place, except for whatever few are going to take the ball and go chase down the Congressional record and look it up, because it will not have been filmed. It will not have been shown to the American people. So, now on the day, I can tell you, I was watching Senate. I saw some good stuff being brought out, but I had to go. I had a dentist appointment. I come back figuring Congress will be in the middle of all of this, and hopefully I can check back and see what I missed. I come back, and there's all these pictures of crowds around the Capitol, and talk of, properly it was an invasion. They probably called it all kinds of uncomplimentary things. But it was just, in fact, everything had been interrupted. Really interrupted. And at first I didn't know what sense to make of that. I wasn't prepared for anything that big. But I'm going to show now the exact moment in which I finally understood how they were doing it. And once you've seen the what and the why, keeping all that information out of the public eye, and the why, because they want to fool everybody into thinking that Biden somehow legitimately won. And furthermore, they want to try to conceal from the American public just how very much our election system for presidents can be gamed. It is a fairly significant extent. as we will get to, especially in the case of Pennsylvania, because we're not looking at a marginal difference of a few 10,000 votes. We're looking at over a couple 100,000 ballots, not real votes, generated in Pennsylvania through that one state, and 20 electoral votes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What was going on, and when did I understand this? What was the goal of having all these people come in? I will show the exact moment. This is after. Oh, let me clarify. Right. Every time I turn up the volume, it turns itself off. And I'm going to show the exact moment. The exact moment I realized what all that crowding and invasion had been about. Because, like I said, I already know the what they want to do, keep this knowledge out, and the why, because they don't want people to know how much it went on, which is an even bigger thing than eliminating Trump. I mean, eliminating Trump was a very big goal, and maybe a very immediately pressing one, but there's still the longer-term goal of being able to throw elections whenever they want and prevent someone who will actually help this country from staying in power. So now we learn. Now we're going to get to the how they did it.
Mr. President, when I arrived in Washington this morning, I fully intended to object to the certification of electoral votes. However, the events that have transpired today have forced me to reconsider, and I cannot now in good conscience object to the certification of these electors. The violence, the lawlessness, and siege of the halls of Congress are abhorrent and stand as a direct attack on the very institution my objection was intended to protect, the sanctity of the American democratic process.
There it is, right there. She was intimidated. Even as they made this song and dance about how, oh, we bravely carried on. No, they didn't. And although she says conscience, no. She threw her conscience away and gave in to cowardice. This whole thing had intimidated her and a lot of others. And by the way, early reports of this whole thing also show something else rather interesting. These crowds, for the most part, headed almost directly to the Senate chamber instead of the House. The House kind of came along later. The House had heard there was an interruption, but in the middle of Paul Gosar's statements, his 5 minutes that he gets, and right in the middle of that, they started to interrupt things for a while, but the problems were at the other end of the building, so they figured they could go back in and allow Paul Gosar of Arizona to go ahead and finish his statement. And then they adjourned again and decided to leave. But the Senate was where the crowd had gone. Why the Senate? Well, in order to have these objections, each objection requires a representative and a senator. And you only get one state for each state. It has to be a separate one. You can't have the same senator volunteering for multiple states. A senator does for Georgia, another senator like that one, she was supposed to do, and as you saw by her own admission, she was planning to do, and would have done if there hadn't been this rude interruption. Now, with that, the American freedom just died. And I realized that in the moment. That's when I saw the point of the strategy. That was the end game of this whole thing, right there. Preventing the evidence from getting to the floor of Congress. Well, they couldn't stop all of it, and that's why I followed with a section of several segments actually playing some of the things that did come out on the floor. Mostly the House of Representatives, a couple small things from the Senate, and there was enough. There was plenty. It still was only a fraction of what there could have been and should have been, but at least we got a snippet of it, a taste of it. That was the one thing they most wanted to avoid. And if we had gone out of the state of Georgia, and if Congress in each house had been shown that famous footage that the one representative made a fleeting mention of, it would have been devastating. There's this, we caught the perpetrators of the fraud in the act. And, there it is. They did this. Let's go take a look at those ballots that came from under the table. And you know what? They got stolen. We're supposed to keep this stuff around for 22 months after the election. And they got stolen before anybody could ever be bothered to go in and start any audits of materials. Well, now we'll never really know, will we? I think we all have a pretty good idea. We know why that would happen. We know what they did. We saw it happen. And what happened there, in that moment, we see it. We see the real purpose of that. There will now be no more debate. And let's watch what happened. All these states were supposed to be featuring objections. Now, let's look what happened in each case.
Parliamentarians advise me is the only certificate of vote from that state that purports to be a return from the state.
Not true.
And that has annexed to it a certificate from an authority of the state purporting to appoint or ascertain electors.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Georgia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Joseph R. Biden Jr. of the state of Delaware received 16 votes for president, and Kamala D. Harris of the state of California received 16 votes for vice president.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. President, myself, members of the Georgia delegation, and some 74 of my Republican colleagues and I object to the electoral votes from the state of Georgia on the grounds that the election conducted on November 3rd was faulty and fraudulent due to unilateral actions by the Secretary of State to unlawfully change the state's election process without approval from the General Assembly, and thereby setting the stage for an unprecedented amount of fraud and irregularities, and I have signed the objection myself.
Sections 15 and 17 of Title III of the United States Code require that any objection be presented in writing, signed by a member of the House of Representatives and a senator. Is the objection in writing and signed by a member and a senator?
President, prior to the actions and events of today, we did, and following the events of today, it appears that some senators have withdrawn their objection.
And with that applause, much like the applause you see in the Star Wars movie when Emperor Palpatine, takes the role of Emperor, and everyone applauded the rise of tyranny, that was applause at the rise of tyranny. That's exactly what that was. But you heard, the man said it there. Several senators, a lot of senators dropped out. The fact of the matter was, they had about a dozen senators lined up, willing to do this, willing to support this. That was a dozen senators. By the end of this, they were lucky to find 2. And we'll get to the other one later on. So that's why they headed to the Senate, because you only have to intimidate a few senators, and you've just lost a whole bunch of states. Representatives, you heard the man. There were 75 more representatives with him, and differing numbers, but all generally that large who stood up. You'd have to intimidate a lot of representatives to stop that. They couldn't do that. But you only need to intimidate the tiniest handful of senators, because they are the bottleneck to this whole thing being able to happen. So that was targeted. They deliberately went to the Senate to intimidate the Senate, and they did, by and large. So we saw that one effect. And there she was, ready to do her patriotic duty for the country. Then all this happens, and all of a sudden, she chickens out. She makes a song and dance about conscience. This was no conscience. She abandoned her conscience in doing that. So let's look at what else happened. We'll follow this with a few more states.
Mr. President, I, along with 70 of my Republican colleagues, object to the counting of the electoral votes for the state of Michigan on the grounds that the error rate precedes the FEC rate allowed at 0.0008%, and that the people who signed affidavits at risk of perjury, their voices have not been heard in a court of law.
Section 15 and 17 of Title III of the U.S. Code require that any objection be presented in writing and signed by a member of the House of Representatives and a senator. Is the objection in writing and signed by a member and a senator?
The objection is writing, not signed by a senator.
In that case, the objection cannot be entertained.
Mr. President,
Mr. President, I and 55 other members of the United States House of Representatives object to the electoral votes of the state of Nevada in order to protect the lawful votes of Nevada and all other American citizens.
Section 15 and 17 of Title III of the United States Code requires that any objection be presented in writing and signed by a member of the House of Representatives and a senator. Is the objection in writing and signed by a member and a senator?
Mr. President, it is in writing, but unfortunately, no United States Senator has joined in this effort.
Mr. President, I object to the electoral votes in the state of Wisconsin because 71 House members, all of whom condemn violence as we witnessed today, are firmly committed to the resolution of disagreements in civil, lawful, peaceful institutions with full and fair debate, free of violence, and though not a single court is allowed an evidentiary hearing to listen to the significant body of evidence of fraud, and though some seize on the court's failure to misrepresent that, no court would listen to the evidence as saying evidence did not exist, while Democrat leaders in Milwaukee illegally and unconstitutionally created more than 200 illegal polling places. Tens of thousands of votes were changed by workers despite election workers' objections, plus so many other illegalities to fraudulently create a 20,000 vote lead. We object along with a senator who now has withdrawn his objection.
Sections 15 and 17 of Title III of the United States Code require that any objection be presented in writing, signed by a member of the House of Representatives and a senator. Is the objection in writing and signed by a member and a senator?
It is in writing, it's signed by a member, but it is not signed and objected to by a senator, Mr. President.
In that case, the objection cannot be entertained.
Mr. President, I object to the word thwarted.
And there it was. We just lost of 6 states. We just lost 4 states being able to say anything. Right there. So the strategy worked. Now some of it's cowardice. I suppose some of it might be convenience. It was a long day. They started this knowing that there would be that they would be spending 12 hours in debate plus whatever time it took to go through the individual states one by one, briefly, as they just say, okay, obviously Biden got California, obviously Trump got, almost any other state you could name, with only a handful of exceptions, interestingly enough, but, Biden got maybe half a dozen states, but they were the ones with, not even counting the fraud, about half a dozen states, and then another half a dozen by fraud. just barely enough to put him over the top. So there it went. But you see, I knew why, I knew what, and in that moment, I realized the how. Which now brings us to something else more important. That invasion was engineered. I think it has to become quite clear. Trump's main hope is one last chance to get justice, to have the votes lawfully and accurately counted. You see, was that session right there. And now that section was punctured and deprived of its usefulness, and in the end, reduced to a mere ceremonial. So nothing of any value was able to take place, very little. We got a little bit from the floor, I presented that. And now we got what was left. Now, there was one other senator who kept his head. And I want to give praise to this senator because he really did a brave and awesome thing. There was a man truly being as brave as everybody else made their song and dance. And that was Senator Hawley. So let's take a look at what he has to say. Okay, Hawley. Oh, let me introduce this. This goes back to Senator. Remember, it was in the middle of the 2-hour period allocated to Arizona that this whole invasion happened. When it was all over, they still, per the law, had to go through the rest of the debate. And Senator Hawley shows that despite everything, he kept his head. And that was why, when it came to the state of Pennsylvania, for which he was the senator involved, they were still going to break for the debate. So now let's look at that.
No further debate?
Oh no. That's not what I got here. Oh. Where is Hawley?
Senator from Missouri.
Oh, here we go.
Thank you. I want to begin this evening by saying thank you to the men and women of the Capitol Hill Police, the National Guardsmen, Metropolitan Police, and others who came to this Capitol, who put their lives on the line to protect everyone here working inside of it. And I want to thank law enforcement all across this country, in my home state of Missouri and everywhere else who do that day in and day out. And I just want to acknowledge that when it comes to violence, this has been a terrible year in America this last year. We've seen a lot of violence against law enforcement as the day we saw here in the capital of the United States. And in this country, in the United States of America, we cannot say emphatically enough, violence is not how you achieve change. Violence is not how you achieve something better. Our Constitution was built and put into place so that there would be, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, no appeal to violence to bullets, which is what we saw, unfortunately, attempted tonight. There is no place for that in the United States of America. And that's why I submit to my colleagues that what we're doing here tonight is actually very important. Because for those who have concerns about the integrity of our elections, those who have concerns about what happened in November, this is the appropriate means. This is the lawful place where those objections and concerns should be heard. This is the forum that the law provides for, our laws provide for those concerns to be registered, not through violence, not by appealing from ballots to bullets, but here in this lawful process. And so to those who say that this is just a formality today, an antique ceremony that we've engaged in for a couple of hundred years, I can't say that I agree. I can't say that our precedents suggest that. I actually think it's very vital what we do. The opportunity to be heard, to register objections is very vital because this is the place where those objections are to be heard and dealt with, debated, and finally resolved. In this lawful means, peacefully, without violence, without attacks, without bullets. And so, Mr. President, let me just say now briefly, in lieu of speaking about it later, a word about Pennsylvania, which is a state that I have been focused on, objected to, as an example of why people are concerned millions of Americans concerned about our election integrity. The state of Pennsylvania, quite apart from allegations of any fraud, you have a state constitution that has been interpreted for over a century to say that there is no mail-in balloting permitted except for in very narrow circumstances that's also provided for in the law. And yet, last year, Pennsylvania elected officials passed a whole new law that allows universal mail-in balloting and did it irregardless of what the Pennsylvania Constitution said. And then when Pennsylvania citizens tried to go and be heard on this subject before the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they were dismissed on grounds of procedure timeliness in violation of that Supreme Court's own precedent. So the merits of the case have never been heard. The constitutionality of the statute actually has never been defended. I'm not aware of any court that has passed on its constitutionality. Actually, I'm not aware of anybody who's defended the constitutionality. And this was the statute that governed this last election, in which there were over 2.5 million mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania. This is my point. That this is the forum. Pennsylvania Supreme Court hasn't heard the case. There's no other court to go to hear the case in the state. And so this is the appropriate place for these concerns to be raised, which is why I have raised them here today. And I hope that this body will not miss the opportunity to take affirmative action to address the concerns of so many millions of Americans, to say to millions of Americans tonight that violence is never warranted, that violence will not be tolerated, that those who engage in it will be prosecuted, but that this body will act to address the concerns of all Americans across the country. We do need an investigation into irregularities, fraud. We do need a way forward together. We need election security reforms. I bet my friends on the other side of the aisle don't disagree with that. We need to find a way to move forward on that together so that the American people, from both parties, all walks of life, can have confidence in our elections, that we can arrange ourselves under the rule of law that we share together. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Okay. There's a man who kept his head. How much so? Well, only one other state did actually break for the debate.
Senate will come to order.
Oh. When they did, however, well, let's see what happened when they did. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe this is back here.
Mr. President, but resolutely, I object to the electoral votes of my beloved Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on the grounds of multiple constitutional infractions that they were not, under all of the known circumstances, regularly given. And on this occasion, I have a written objection signed by a senator and 80 members of the House of Representatives. Is the objection in writing and signed by a senator? Yes, Mr. President, it is. An objection presented in writing and signed by both a representative and a senator complies with the law. Chapter 1, Title 3 of the United States Code. The clerk will report the objection.
We, a United States Senator and members of the House of Representatives, object to the counting of the electoral votes of the state of Pennsylvania on the ground that they were not, under all of the known circumstances, regularly given. Signed, Josh Hawley, United States Senator, Scott Perry, Member of Congress.
Are there further objections to the certificates from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? The chair hears none. Two houses will withdraw from joint session. Each house will deliberate separately on the pending objection and report its decision back to the joint session. The Senate will now retire to its chambers.
There we go. So Pennsylvania alone got debated. Unfortunately, even half of that got lost. Let's take a look at what happened in the Senate when that happened.
Senate will come to order. Majority Leader. No further debate.
He allowed no further debate.
Pursuant to SCOM Res 1 and Section 17 of Title 3 United States Code, when the two houses withdraw from the joint session to count the electoral vote for separate consideration of an objection, a senator may speak to the objection for 5 minutes, not more than once. The Debate shall not exceed 2 hours, after which the chair will put the question, shall the objection be sustained? The clerk will report the objection made in the joint session.
Objection from Senator Hawley from Missouri and Representative Perry from Pennsylvania. He, a United States Senator and member of the House of Representatives, objects to the counting of the electoral votes on the state of Pennsylvania on the ground that they were not, under all of the known circumstances, regularly given.
Majority Leader.
No further debate.
If there's no further debate, if there's no further debate, the question shall be, shall the objection submitted by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, the senator from Missouri, Mr. Hawley, be sustained? Is there a sufficient second? The clerk will call the roll.
In short, the Senate did nothing useful with that time. At least the House still did some more stuff from the floor. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, the main emphasis was the constitutional aspect, in particular the part about extending the deadline several days beyond, coupled with also allowing ballots that had been mailed on there and or also predating ballots. You know, they could come to the post office a day or 2 or 3 late, and they could still set the stamp to an older date to make it look like it made it on time, when in fact it didn't. So all of these things taken together added about a couple hundred, 2 or 3, several 100,000 ballots into the pile. And they were segregated for a time. The hope and the intention was that those received on time would be counted, and then those received afterwards would be counted separately. Well, if that separate count was ever done, nobody seems to have heard anything about it. But I think you can safely bet that if you counted the ones that were in on time, Trump won Pennsylvania. If you count the ones beyond that, well, Trump won Pennsylvania by somewhere between 200 and 300,000 votes. But if you count the ones beyond, which are almost entirely Biden, it could be a tiny trickle of, Trump votes that just got lost in the mail for a couple of days, that kind of thing. But they would be a handful. The rest were all Biden ballots. And at the last moment, at the end of the time, people are done voting. Where did all these ballots come from? Well, this comes down to things like, the post office truck guy who brought a bunch of these ballots that didn't even really come from Pennsylvania. They were printed someplace else and brought into the state to be thrown in after the fact. That's through the election of Pennsylvania. That would have been the principal thing. Hence, in the House, the argumentations, again, focused primarily on the constitutional aspect, which had actually been pretty well covered back in Arizona's case. So a lot of it was unfortunately repetitive, but there were a few things, and I did share what there was, and there was some interest. So that's what happened. Right? They achieved that goal. Now, I turn to the question of the perpetrators. The invasion, therefore, was engineered. Well, there were a lot of things that worked, many of which I was not aware of at the time, but learned about it just through normal accounts that have leaked out anyway, and that had to do with things like the guards did let people in. In fact, I can even show some of that. The guards were actually letting people in, and they opened the doors. People didn't have to push the doors open. The guards opened the doors. And they wandered in. And I have some footage here that somebody who was actually among those had uploaded. And And needless to say, this is one of those bits of footage that rapidly disappeared. And I'm going to find this very shortly. And here it is. Hold on, let's do it again. So the doors are open peacefully, and they just walk in. Come on in, folks. You see those people standing along the walls? Those are the Capitol Police, just standing there like those wooden cigar store Indians as everybody walks by. Everything short of saluting the crowd as they went in. Come on in, yeah. Go on in. And then, when they got enough, they just calmly close the doors, and the crowd stops coming in.
Most importantly, we've got our several Antifa members that will do something violent. False flag.
It was a false flag operation. Yeah, there were some, probably 2% of the crowd. But those were the ones who did the actual physical destruction of what little there was. Broke the several windows that got broke and things of that nature. It really was surprisingly little damage, but what was done by the Antifa infiltrators. Unfortunately, more serious was the various agents provocateurs of who knows what federal agency. They always like to blame the FBI. Could have been then, could have been CIA, NSA, even ATF, who the heck knows? I mean, or any of hundreds of others known and unknown alphabet soup agencies. But one or another of them infiltrated various groups that somehow, despite saying, oh, we love Trump, they don't listen to Trump, who told anybody who was interested in anything like that, stand back and stand down and go peacefully. And we even have that too. He was quite explicit about peaceful.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol. Right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for...
Cheering on from outside the building. Now, there's some other footage that's come out where we have this Roy Epps saying, let's go in the Capitol, in the Capitol, in the Capitol. Where did you get that from? No one's asked him that question. When they finally interviewed the guy, they softballed the whole thing, and they never once got to what was he doing there? What was that all about? They didn't get to that. But that was the thing. And it's interesting that when he said that, the crowd around them were calling him, you're some kind of Fed. You're an agent provocateur. You're trying to get people to do something illegal. We're not going to do that. I find that interesting. But Trump here is calling for peace.
Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Well, that's all we got. But you see, peaceful, patriotic, so that Congress will try to count only the ones that should be counted. So, that's what happened. So who were the perpetrators? Well, why would the guards open up the doors and let people in? And then as we even saw later, you see guards escorting that one crazy guy with horns on his head all around, you mean the grand tour, all by himself. Why? And there's even been reports that somebody at the central area pressed some button that unlocked electric locks on a lot of the doors so they could be opened. These guards were ordered to do these things. Who ordered them? Well, you got to go up the chain of command. The sergeant of arms is in charge of them. And who's in charge of the sergeant of arms? Nancy Pelosi. That's what the Speaker of the House is in charge of the Sergeant of Arms, who is in turn in charge of and responsible for security of the Capitol. He's the one who directs the Capitol Police and tells them what to do. And there's no way he would have given that order of himself or allowed the people, the individual Capitol Police, to do stuff that goes completely against their training and completely against the oaths they took as officers and everything else. They did what they did because they were ordered to do that. And that order, by sheer deduction, would absolutely have to come either from Nancy Pelosi or through her, because it involves her telling the Sergeant of Arms to tell those police, let the crowds in. That's footage I'd like to see. Instead, she manages to see to it that her daughter is there to record footage of, I guess, whatever might maybe be useful. Very little of it was, although found among that footage is Nancy Pelosi making a very Hollywood-like exit or something like that. That was planned. It was all planned. And it was engineered by her who knew it. Now, let us take a look at one other architect of this whole thing. And this person also knew. And he's writing, whatever we're going to hear here from Chuck Schumer was said by him while, in the Senate chamber before the invasion took place. Bear that in mind. It broke apart between the House and the Senate for the state of Arizona. The invasion had not happened yet. So all the senators and representatives at this time assumed that it would all be peaceful and that nothing was going to happen. And yet, listen to what this man says. Insurrection.
Discouraged by the leadership of the majority party, but it was not quelled. It is a very sad comment on our times that merely accepting the results of an election is considered an act of political courage. Sadder and more dangerous still is the fact that an element of the Republican Party believes their political viability hinges on the endorsement of an attempted coup. That anyone, much less an elected official, would be willing to tarnish our democracy in order to furnish their personal political fortunes. Insurrection was doomed.
He's spinning the narrative for the whole thing. He's coining the word insurrection for all of this. That was no insurrection. It was a couple hundred tourists wandering outside the Capitol, taking selfies and so forth, basically taking nothing but pictures and leaving nothing but footprints like your classical good Boy Scouts, and then wandering back out. If that's supposed to be an insurrection, by the way, even the FBI concluded there was no insurrection. And clearly, that interrupted the whole thing that could potentially have still given Trump a crack at being able to return to the White House as he had won among the actual voters of America. So, there's one more. There's a couple more tidbits I want to get into, and then I'm going to close. Tidbit number one: those guards. You might remember they talk about the deaths of several guards. There's the one guy, although Tucker Carlson found footage of him obviously alive and well, clearly well after the time he was supposedly attacked. He may have had something thrown at him or something, but clearly we're not talking about an attack that had any evidence of anything life-threatening to it. So that was probably something separate. But now let's talk about two other guards. They supposedly committed suicide. I don't believe that. All right. I don't have details of their deaths. I don't have any of that stuff on hand. I'll tell you that up front. But I think those other two guards were suicided. That is to say, you make a murder look like a suicide, so that people think, oh, they killed themselves. No, actually, they were made to look like they killed themselves because they were threatening to tell the world, the press, anybody and everybody that would listen, how they had been ordered to let the crowds in. And that story could not be allowed out. And if they were not going to back down, and they weren't, because they were patriotic men, then they got suicided. You're playing with your life here. And they got suicided. I think more investigation needs to be made into their deaths. I'm sure they far too summarily said, oh, they killed themselves, when in fact a detailed investigation will, in high likelihood, show they were in fact murdered. So, that's one thing. Point 2. What about Pence? I'm thinking probably some people have been a little hard on Pence. He's up there saying, oh, the parliamentarians, he could be lying, or probably at least as likely, maybe more so, these mysterious, unknown, unnamed, and unnameable parliamentarians lied to him. The thing was, he seems to have been given the idea that it's just his job to read these things, and that's it. Now, he could have called forth either set of electors. There really were 2 for those 5 states, plus New Mexico, not that that's relevant. He could have called forth either set. And either way, I'm sure there would have been a debate. So it wouldn't have mattered. So he should have been able to do either one. There'd be a debate. Hopefully the debate would bring out enough reason for at least most of these states to have a chance to be recounted, and give or take the findings in the recounting possibly returned to the Trump column. Maybe even enough that Trump lawfully and visibly carries on in the White House as the American voters desired. Maybe. I mean, the only absolute evidence is to do those forensic counts. So he went in there trying to program, look, just go ahead and say the Democrat ones, because they were there first, and they're the only ones the parliamentarians giving to you anyway, even though there were other ones also received lawfully and with all the lawful accoutrements that should have been brought forth. And so he kind of, and if the interruptions hadn't happened, we'd have had all these debates, you see? And it wouldn't have mattered. He could have gone eeny, miny, mo, and picked this slate for this state, and that slate for that state. Either way, there would be 6 debates. And after the debate, they would do whatever. Now suddenly there's no debates, and this little programming of, oh, I'm going to read these, well, it's too late for me to prepare my mind for doing anything else. So he kind of got jockeyed into a position. And then he wants to kind of pretend that this is all just this, an old ceremony. Well, Josh Hawley, I think, spoke to that issue extremely well. This place was the one last forum. After the courts has failed, after all the other attempts at trying to get the law to intervene against this obvious fraud had failed, this was the one last recourse America had to straighten all this mess out. And after Arizona, with just a little bit on Pennsylvania from the House, it ended up being reduced to a mere ceremonial that is pointless. And even since tried to enact a law to that effect. I hope someday the Supreme Court finds that law unconstitutional. The point of that meeting is to do that. So I think that finishes what there is to say on this. A lot of the further details on fraud came out on an issue of Time magazine, where they actually took pride in it. Why would they do that? That's one more thing. Time magazine. Why would they do this? Why would they? So whoever wrote that article. Well, if anyone has seen the movie Wag the Dog, the producer guy creates this whole fake war of Albania, and this whole bit about an attack that involves a nuclear bomb in a suitcase, smuggled across the Canadian border into America, and so on. And the good old Shu is stuck in somewhere in Albania, and they got to rescue him, blah, blah. That director had saved, had made an election go a certain way with all of his propaganda. And then at the end of it all, credit was being given to this stupid commercial about, oh, you don't want to change horses in midstream. And the guy says, they can't give that to credit. I made it happen, and I'm getting the credit. You're playing with your life, but he wanted the credit. He had done this brilliant, clever thing, and he wanted the credit. Only here, there's nobody to kill the people involved, because there were just way too many. They wanted the credit for, a stolen election. Oh, they call it fortifying election, which is just an obvious euphemism for saying making sure that our guy, the big guy, wins no matter what the American voters do. And that is what January 6th was really all about. Trump is obviously in no way a perpetrator of it. He did not want anything like that to happen. He took measures to prevent it by trying to call in the National Guard. He called somebody at the Pentagon, send me at least 10,000 National Guard troops. And somebody at the other end of the phone said, yes, Mr. President. And then they just didn't do it. They disobeyed their commander-in-chief. Whoever answered that phone or whoever over the Pentagon decided to disobey that direct order from America's commander-in-chief of our military, that person should be more than court-martialed. He should be dishonorably discharged and everything else possible and crime and put in crime for treason. So Trump thought he was solved, goes on to the next thing. But there was no National Guard. There was no guards at all. How are we going to have this invasion if there's people around? Guards and police and military people around. How can you stage an invasion? So there it was. Trump clearly was the victim and the target of all of this. He's not a perpetrator. He's a victim. This is like blaming the girl for getting raped. You can't even show that she dressed provocatively. She just got raped, and now suddenly it's her fault? Only Trump is not the one to play the victim card. He doesn't do that. I respect that about him, but let's be clear. He was the victim of this, pure and simple.